Hello, Louis.
Hi, Glenn.
Welcome to the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. I'm Glenn Loury of Brown University. Happy to be speaking with my colleague, Louis Putterman, also of Brown University. Thanks for joining us, Louis.
Well, thank you very much for having me back.
So we had a previous conversation based on this interesting book of yours, The Good, the Bad, and the Economy, with a subtitle that I don't remember and I don't have the book in front of me.
Yeah. Does human nature rule out a better world?
Does human nature rule out a better world? And we had an interesting discussion, but we only got through like the first half of the book. So I wanted to invite you back so that we could continue with this. The audience response to the discussion we had previously was very positive. People thought they were getting a lot out of it, and I know that I was. So as I understand it, in the second part of the book, you're taking up the question of why some nations have fared much better than others in recent economic history in terms of economic growth, and attempting to offer an explanation of this variance across countries in the level of economic prosperity that adds to and in some ways differs from other explanations that are out there. So if I characterize that correctly, could you just explain what you're doing? And if I characterize it incorrectly, could you set the record straight before explaining what you're doing?
No, you characterize it very well. I'm trying to explain, or at least to give a partial explanation of both what accounts for which countries are rich and which countries are poor today, and what accounts for which among the less developed countries have been achieving economic growth in the last 30 years or so, and which show less signs of growth. This is sometimes called comparative economic development.
Okay, so what is the received wisdom in present-day economic thinking about why there's so much disparity across countries between Northern Europe and North America on the one hand and Sub-Saharan Africa, say, on the other? What's the thinking, and how are you making a contribution there?
Well, there's really a lot of different ideas. I'm not sure that there is any clear consensus. In the recent book called Why Nations Fail by Acemoglu and Robinson, they argued that there are three alternative explanations that are going around, and that the most accepted explanation among economists is what they call the ignorance hypothesis. That means that some countries are much poorer than others because their leaders don't understand what it takes to have a dynamic, successful economy. So ignorance of the right economic policies is the main explanation. I'm not sure that's really a correct description of what economists believe, but on the other hand, there doesn't seem to be a clear consensus among economists as to what the causes are. There are a lot of different possibilities. The institutions approach that Acemoglu and Robinson use in that book and in a number of their academic papers is definitely one of the candidates. And that approach says that countries that have effective government institutions, including protection of private property and thus creation of incentives to invest both in skills and invest in plant and equipment and in research. Good institutions is the main ingredient for economic development, and that what distinguishes the rich and the poor countries is that the rich countries hit upon the right formula of good institutions, starting with Britain about 250 years ago, and then spreading to other countries. Until recently, most of them European or European populated.
Now, this is what Neil Ferguson, the historian, refers to as the killer apps. Have you heard that? You know what I'm talking about?
Actually, I'm a little bit out of the loop on that, but so I have to follow your suggestion and read up on it next.
No.
But he's a historian, so
this is the
my
pop
reading
science.
was narrowly economics.
No, I probably oughtn't to have mentioned it at your level, Louis. This is the kind of pop science popularization version of it. This historian who's at the Harvard Business School who writes in the Financial Times and other places. You know what I'm talking about, Neil Ferguson. He has a high profile, but he's not a deep scholarly investigator of these matters. He calls them killer apps. These growth promoting institutions of private property, rule of law, and all this kind of stuff. Okay, so there's the ignorance hypothesis. Leaders don't know the right policies in some countries. There's the institutions explain everything hypothesis, which attempts to account for why some countries are growing and others not by reference to institutions that are promoting of economic investment and growth. And what other hypotheses are on the table?
Well, the third one that Acemoglu and Robinson count is what they call a culture explanation. And this is some variant of Max Weber's Protestant ethic idea, that some countries have a good culture for hard work and investment and invention and so forth, and other countries have a bad culture. And they naturally lampoon that on grounds that not too many years ago, people were saying that China would never grow because Confucian culture holds it back, and now the most dynamic part of the world is in East Asia, the set of countries that have a Confucian cultural background. So the people inclined to a cultural hypothesis have just reclassified and said, oh, Protestant or Confucian, those are what you need.
Okay, they are a moving target.
You're right. And so in some ways that's fair enough. But the approach that I am suggesting has some things in common. You could call it a cultural approach in that I'm talking about attitudes and values and skills and valuation of skills that are embedded in particular social groups. So you might call that culture in a sense. But the focus for me is on what historical factors might account for some groups having these attitudes and orientations that have made them economically successful and other groups not.
Okay, I'm interested both in the specific attitudes and values you have in mind, and also what you mean by groups.
Mm-hmm. So the groups are basically ethnic groups, basically groups of people who speak a common language and have some sense of common history and tend to hand attitudes and values down from generation to generation. And one of the things that's most amazing about the recent research that I've done, some of it collaboratively, is the evidence of the persistence of these traits. Although for the most part we're looking at indirect evidence, we're looking at the fact that groups that seemed economically successful as much as 500 years ago still seem to be economically successful today. And then I'm filling in a missing piece and conjecturing that it's something about their values and attitudes and skill sets, what I call social capability, which is being transmitted over the generations within these groups.
Okay, now the baseline empirical finding is a persistence over long periods of time in the beneficial or detrimental effects of, in persistence over long periods of time in the economic success or lack thereof of groups of persons identified by culture of origin or ethnic group of origin or something like that.
Right.
Again, I'm groping here, but just trying to make sure I grasp what's at issue. Persistence over long periods of time and how well or poorly people who can be identified as having descended from a common ethno-linguistic stock have experienced. That's the baseline empirical finding, and then you speculate that that persistence gives evidence of the significance of cultural or attitudinal patterns peculiar to these ethno-linguistic population groups that have been transmitted within the group from one generation to the next.
Exactly. Yep. So
Okay, now,
most of the empirical work is done at the country level, looking at various European countries compared to various sub-Saharan African countries and different Asian countries, and showing continuities of economic strength within country. But we started looking more at the ethnic group level when we looked at countries that have more diverse populations, especially as a result of the large-scale population movements during the colonial period and afterwards. So basically the Americas and Australia and New Zealand and maybe a couple of other places like Fiji in Oceania. And also I like to refer to a few unusual Asian countries, Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore in particular, that are mainly repopulated by different people than lived there more than 500 years ago. So over the course of the European colonial or period of European expansion, many countries came to be populated mostly by people of different origin than populated them before. And to account for that, we might look at different ethnic groups within these countries. So, for example, we'd look at Nicaragua. We see some people who are mainly descended from the indigenous Amerindians, and we see some other people who are mainly descended from Spanish migrants, and we see some other people who are mainly descended from Africans who came over as slaves to various Caribbean islands. And we can distinguish the economic outcomes for these groups and associate those outcomes with the outcomes of people in the home country.
Again, let me make sure I'm understanding. Within, let's say, Nicaragua, as one looks as between the European descended, the Amerindian descended, and the African descended populations within, one finds their relative position matching up somehow with the general degree of economic prosperity that one associates with those populations from their points of origin.
Yep, exactly. And if we look at the Americas as a whole, basically you tend to see three kinds of countries in the Western Hemisphere in terms of population origins. So you have a few countries that are overwhelmingly populated by people of European descent, which is the U.S., Canada, and Argentina and Uruguay, a little less so Chile. Then you have some countries that are predominantly Amerindian or mixed Amerindian-European, which would be the Andean countries like Peru and Bolivia and Mexico and most of Central America. And then you have countries that have a majority of people of African descent, which is mainly the Caribbean countries, but you see some of the Caribbean black population in the Caribbean coast of the mainland South America also. And of course the U.S. and Brazil with major African descended minorities.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I was going to say is that probably the starkest evidence or the starkest example of difference between the Acemoglu and Robinson interpretation of what's happened in the Americas and my interpretation is to look at those different groups of countries. For Acemoglu and Robinson, they talk about what they call a reversal of fortune. They say that during the colonial period and its aftermath, the parts of the Americas that were the most advanced before 1500, which were the civilizations of the Andes and of Mexico, they became relatively poor And the parts of the Americas that were the least advanced, they were also less densely populated. They had little or less intensive forms of agriculture. So that would be Canada, the U.S., and Argentina and Uruguay. They became relatively rich, especially Canada and the U.S., of course. And also that the Caribbean islands that in the 1700s up to the early 1800s were relatively rich and very valuable sources of wealth for the European plantation owners became poor. This is all part of a reversal in the fortunes of these people. And Acemoglu and Robinson explain that entirely as a function of the institutions that the people adopted, that good institutions were adopted, especially in the U.S. and Canada, and less good institutions were adopted in the Amerindian-dominated areas, partly because of the nature of the colonial system, where the indigenous people were made into a semi-slave kind of position, and similarly with the Caribbean, because the population started in slavery. They haven't found the right institutions. So their punchline is that if these countries were to adopt the right institutions, they would become rich like Canada and the U.S. also. My interpretation is that if you line up the countries by the level of technology and complexity of economy and many other indicators like literacy and so forth, of the ancestors of the current population at the time of colonization, you would find there's actually basically a persistence of economic status. So Europeans were more advanced in 1500 than Amerindians, even though there was a civilization in Mexico and the Andes. That civilization lacked ironworking and steel. It lacked as sophisticated a writing system. It certainly lacked the history of literature and knowledge of history that the Europeans had. They lacked horses and various kinds of weapons and so forth. Yeah. And the Europeans were more advanced in 1500. The European-dominated countries are richer today. The Amerindian populations were less advanced in 1500. The countries that have majority Amerindian descent are less wealthy today. Similarly, the countries that have majority African-descended population are poorer today, and the countries that they came from had a lower technological level back in 1500. Now the big question is,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I
want to ask a question at some point. Well, maybe
why don't you break in? I have spoken too much, please.
Well, not too much, but I will break in just to ask. Well, what about the methods by which these non-European countries came to be, brought within the orbit of European civilization through conquest, colonial domination, the enslavement of persons? Those are neither cultural factors particular to the peoples in question, nor are they institutions as such. They may be related to the institutions that ultimately are adopted in a given place, but they would seem to have some role here in accounting for present-day economic status. If the country had been dominated by European colonialization, if the populations had been decimated by wars of conquest, if the populations largely descend from people who had been held in bondage and had been stigmatized and against whom discrimination might be practiced and so on. So where does that fit in? That's one question. And then the other question was, what about genes? I mean, you're assuming that these population groups whose influences are persistent over a long period of time are passing on through cultural mechanism from one generation to the next. But how do you rule out the possibility that what you're observing is due to the passing on of genetic information encoded in the DNA that has economic consequences?
Right. Okay. So you've cut to two of the most important questions. Let me deal with the genes question first. I mean, here, I don't have a direct way to rule out an effect of genes, but basically I accept, based on a variety of different kinds of evidence, that there's no fundamental genetic difference in the ability to acquire skills, acquire the sorts of attitudes that might be necessary for economic success, etc. You know, partly this is because one can come up with examples of people equally successful from any ethnic or genetic background. And it's simply an easier assumption that people start more or less equal. One could go further and use the whole explanation of Jared Diamond, with which I make a lot of use of in my book, to sort of explain who got ahead in the first place. And who got ahead in the first place is almost certainly initially determined by where agricultural revolutions occurred and where densely populated agrarian societies grew up and what opportunities they had to interact with each other. Diamond argues that the physical environment, the presence of the kinds of large seeded grasses that would make for good domesticable grains, and the presence of the right kind of domesticable animals, that these are the causes of where agricultural civilizations grew. And that is part of his strategy for arguing that there's no genetic difference in capability among groups. They just were dealt a different hand by nature. I don't have much to say about that. It seems quite plausible to me, and I'd like to accept that as a working hypothesis, that there is no genetic difference between groups. As for exactly why agriculture started where it did, I mean, one needs to be an expert on the locations of these different precursor crops and so forth, and I'm really not. I have collected data about the dates of origin of agriculture and have verified that the number of years in which a country has predominantly relied upon agriculture is a very good predictor of its level of development today. Going further, if we look at transplanted people, like the populations in the Americas, the number of years that the population's ancestors were in an agrarian society is a good predictor of the level of development today. As to where agriculture started and why, I don't really try to make any new contribution beyond what Diamond's done and what other people are now discussing. So,
okay, again, I just want to try to summarize in my own words that there are these differences going way back between the level of civilizational sophistication, if you will, associated with crop cultivation, domestication of animals and such, which you feel can be explained along the lines of Jared Diamond without reference to genetic differences between Northern Europeans on the one hand and Sub-Saharan Africans on the other, say. There are these differences. What you're doing is taking as given the existence of these differences in long ago economic history, and then tracing through the implications of those differences, independent of institutions, for explaining inequality among countries today.
Yeah, exactly. But then you sort of asked me, what about the institutions, or what about the mediating historical experiences, which I think is a great question. Yeah. And in a sense, I consider this the next frontier for my research. I hope that I would be able to make some more headway on understanding what specific factors have contributed to the persistence of differences between these different groups of people. I think it's very clear that forms of exploitation and political power stratification were put in place during the colonial era that contributed greatly to perpetuating differences. But the differences were there in the first place because of the sorts of things that Diamond talked about. So the Europeans were able to enslave the Africans because of differences in their technology and culture and so forth. It wasn't a random draw that the Europeans enslaved the Africans rather than the Africans the Europeans. Similarly, it wasn't a random draw that the Europeans took over Mesoamerica rather than the Mesoamericans taking over Europe. But once the Europeans took over, they converted people into slaves and peons and whatnot. There were power relations that greatly helped to perpetuate these differences over the course of 4+ centuries, which is really, really striking. And since I am often asked whether my approach suggests that we should be very pessimistic about the people of say, sub-Saharan Africa or New Guinea or the large Amerindian populations in places like Guatemala, let's say, catching up, maybe I should be very pessimistic because, well, they've been behind for 4,000 years or longer, so it's going to take them thousands of years to catch up. My typical response is not necessarily. It might be possible to catch up very quickly if we understand that the differences between these people have to do with their sort of human software, mental software, cognitive orientations, attitudes, attitudes towards knowledge, for example, towards formal learning, towards skill acquisition, and towards work discipline. If those things can be changed in a generation, if we can create the right social environment, and I would even argue that there's been rather dramatic change over the last 2 generations that I think is going to be increasingly showing up. So I believe that the gap in terms of social capability between Africa and Europe has actually been closing quite substantially over the last 30 years. But we don't see that reflected yet in economic statistics. We don't see it reflected very much in terms of closing gap in standard of living. That gap has actually been opening until recently.
Can I just intervene for a moment to ask you another question? Because if I take seriously the cultural friendly account that you've been giving, some populations dating back hundreds of years were better placed than others in terms of the level of their civilizational development to experience economic growth. Those populations have spread throughout the world, but even when we look here centuries later, taking account of the origins of present-day populations, we see correlations across countries in the economic well-being that is lines up with these long-standing differences. And we think that it's passed on within groups, that is, within ethnic, linguistic networks of people who are linked to one another. We think it's passed on within families, within communities and so on, one generation to the next. And all of that suggests that mechanisms of communication and interconnections amongst persons are important. And that 500 years ago, with the levels of tech, or 300 years ago, or 150 years ago, with the levels of technology then extant, those connections would have been very much, close-knit. I mean, you have to be living in the same town. You have to be speaking the same language. You've got to be related to somebody by blood in order to have the message get over to you. But now, in the world that we live in today, with revolutions being spread across national boundaries through social network, and with people able to use cell phones in very backward countries in order to access information or to facilitate the functioning of markets or whatever it might be, with people able to learn a university lesson from a lecturer at Stanford or at the University of Michigan or even here at Brown, while they sit in a Latin American or African or South Asian country. With all of that, it strikes me that the possibilities for cultural propagation of ideas going forward will be much more, transnational and much less tied to the fact that I'm located in this place or that I descend from this group of people or that. Do you think that's a right intuition?
I very much. I mean, you took my breath away because you've said things I've been thinking over the last year or so and trying to articulate. So I guess I would be getting a lot further with my research if I had you on my team. But
my office is right downstairs.
No, but I mean, maybe you have more important things to do. I mean, the only reservation is that I don't want to entirely downplay the importance of those close connections and the family environment and the immediate community. I don't think that we're completely away from the world in which those things matter a lot. But I think that the ability of ideas and even attitudes to diffuse much more rapidly is very much ongoing. And also, we have a different world institutionally. I think the world in which you could enslave the people who were your technological inferiors, or make them into the laborers on your plantation and so forth, is largely over. No, not 100% over, but we've made a lot of progress in the last 100 years or so. And we even have world institutions where we have world bodies like the United Nations Development Program, for example, and lots of NGOs and so forth, dedicated to trying to help those who are at a developmental disadvantage to make up the difference. And I think in this very different kind of world, we can be much more optimistic about these gaps closing.
Yeah,
so
I see.
That's basically it.
Okay, now what about foreign aid? There's this debate that's out there. I'm wondering how your thinking intersects with this debate. One thinks of Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University and who's the guy?
Easterly, William Easterly.
Oh, yeah, Bill Easterly, right. White Man's Burden at New York University. Arguing about, well, if I understand Sachs, the rich countries should be more generous, and if they were, they would help to create circumstances in which poor countries could catch up more rapidly. And if I understand Easterly, oh, no. Western aid has really done more harm than good on the whole, and the evidence doesn't suggest that it's much at all implicated in narrowing the gaps between countries. Does that debate intersect at all with what you're doing? And if so, what do you think about it?
Well, there's some intersection. The most important thing is to try to work out the implications of my findings for the way that development policies should be designed and the way that aid, if there is to be aid, ought to be directed. I personally think that both Sachs and Easterly have important things to say. But I think it comes down to a moral question, ultimately. I mean, I personally believe that the rich people and rich countries have some obligation towards the poorest in the world. We can debate to what extent this should be done through our taxes and to what extent it should be done by voluntary charitable contributions, but it seems to me, knowing the conditions under which the poorest of the poor live, let's say the bottom billion in the world, that there's just no excuse morally to do nothing about that. I mean, many of us have extra discretionary resources. and to use it on some of the frivolous things that we do, and not make anything available to help the poorest. I just can't understand that as morally defensible. But the question is, what would be the good uses of this money?
Exactly.
And I think Easterly is entirely right that a lot of aid has done more harm than good. It's government to government aid, sometimes propping up bad governments, often serving as kind of a free resource, like a rent that the elite gets to channel to its own purposes.
Right.
Aid then functions, much like the revenue from diamonds or oil.
Right.
And so I think there's a lot to that critique, and we have to discover the better ways to get aid to those who need it. Maybe a lot more should be at the grassroots level. Maybe a lot more should be directed to hands-on health and education expenditures, as opposed to going through governments, which can channel it into military or into the bank accounts of the officials. Helping with institutional reform itself, helping with building capabilities to operate an effective and a less corrupt civil service, for example, seems to me to be a very high priority. And then more generally, I think that if my social capability interpretation of what accounts for who's rich and who's poor and who is growing and who's not, if there's something to that interpretation, then it suggests that we want to focus aid to a significant degree, if not entirely, on human capital formation or human skill formation. And in that respect, I diverge a little bit from the traditional economics idea of human capital as sort of what's obtained through formal learning, through book learning and in schools. I think it's also a matter of the experiences that people have access to, their exposures to different ways of doing things. And I think there might even be a case to be made for allowing people to participate in sectors of economic activity which are not necessarily profitable in the short run, but that can allow the acquisition of skills and sort of the informal things, work routines.
What's an example of that?
Excuse me?
I asked for an example of allowing people to participate in what might not be economically cost-benefit effective activities, but that cultivate the kind of human capital that you think is important.
Well, it may be. I don't have a perfectly ready example. I guess education itself might offer some examples. It might be that involving more people on the delivery side of educational institutions, even without evidence of a very high monetary rate of return to education, that could be an example. The broader example that I often use has to do with the capability of operating large-scale organizations such as governments.
Yeah.
I believe, and I argue in my book, that one of the reasons for the success of the East Asian economies is that they have a long tradition of bureaucratic management of states, for lack of a better term. In other words,
Yeah.
There was this examination system in China, and there was a fairly large bureaucracy operating over a vast territory, helping
Yeah.
to forge a unified national identity over a much larger territory than existed in other parts of the world.
Right.
And that created capabilities and I would argue attitudes about the nature of organization. The fact that there are loyalties beyond the immediate family or the clan. The fact that there sort of maybe an acceptance of a principle of hierarchy, that one must do one's part in a larger organization and not simply milk that organization for the benefit of oneself or one's family. I would argue that the ability to operate this kind of state was one of the strongest assets that Japan and South Korea and China and Taiwan had as they worked on their modernization. And I would contrast that with, let's say, a lot of sub-Saharan African countries where the state was a completely artificial creation that was just
Indeed.
kind of handed over to them by departing colonial powers, and then very often just became the personal property of an individual and their immediate cronies and family.
Yeah, or the site of contestation and conflict between various population subgroups that fought for control of the state. Yeah.
Right. So I think this is an example of attitudes that grow from long-term experience of operating a certain kind of institution, and that can be used for good or bad. But what was amazing to me, I started as a development scholar studying Tanzania, which was trying to follow this Chinese path of socialism that I think we talked about a little bit last time, and then turned my gaze to China and was looking at China following ostensibly a similar model, but with very different degree of success. And this is one of the things that brought to my mind that, well, maybe there's a deep difference in terms of their capacity to operate these state institutions, and it has something to do with their history.
But now, on a pessimistic note, it occurs to me that, all right, one of these areas of cultural, political practice is the ability to sustain democratic, electoral, political processes, and that the effort to spread democracy through the world has a less than exactly compelling record of success. I mean, we have the examples of Iraq and Afghanistan, in the case of the United States, to look at most recently. We also perhaps have the example of sub-Saharan Africa, where, I don't know, as long as I've been cognizant of political economy discussions about development in Africa, people have been talking about democratization, about fostering democratic institutions, about developing democratic institutions. And while, of course, there has been some progress, there are still areas where democratic governance is a long way from being realized. So if we can't effectively export democracy, and I leave that as a question whether we can or can't, though it seems that we cannot, what's the prospect for policy of any kind, whether it not be financial aid, but it be more direct involvement in fostering certain kinds of institutional practices in these countries? What's the prospect that we could be successful in narrowing the status between countries by promoting the development of these kinds of institutions?
Right. Well, the democracy per se is definitely a tricky question, and the fact that China has been very successful with transforming its economy, partly because of a strong and highly capable state, but without democracy, might be used as an example to suggest maybe democracy in the Western sense is not absolutely necessary for bringing people out of poverty. I don't want to say that democracy is not highly desirable. I don't want to be put in that camp. But in terms of early stages of modernization and becoming part of the industrial world, China seems to demonstrate that political democracy in the Western sense is not a requirement. So I think there's a lot of diversity of capacity for practicing democracy. I must admit that I'm still somewhat inclined to the view I'm told is a bit old-fashioned, but the view of maybe 20 years ago that there was a natural progression as represented by Japan and by South Korea and Taiwan, where as a country becomes more economically developed and has a larger middle class and more educated people, et cetera, you will see increasing demands for democratic institutions. And I still am inclined to think that there's some truth to that, but I understand that this is very controversial among social scientists these days.
This is democracy following growth rather than the other way around.
Right, that can be the case. Of course, if you can get democracy first, it might very well be a critical input to having a more responsive state that does more to foster growth. So it could go in both directions. And as far as Africa is concerned, I mean,
yeah.
I personally, I think that we're seeing a number of examples that are fairly hopeful emerging just over the last 10 years or so. And you know, when we look at things from a long-term historic point of view that thinks in terms of hundreds of years,
Yeah.
The ability of the African countries in the 50 years of decolonization to have gone into the depths of almost, you know, universal dictatorship and such widespread civil wars and so forth, to signs of the beginning of some real democratic traditions developing in at least a few countries in this short period of time, I think that there's the possibility for some real optimism there.
I see. So the kind of statecraft, I mean, you'd made a statement earlier that you thought in the case of Japan, China, for instance, that their long heritage of managing a large political entity that expands over extensive geographic space, and that might incorporate diverse peoples, but that nevertheless required the maintenance of a bureaucracy and the kind of attitudes about the management of national institutions that are that grow up in that circumstance, that served them very well. And if I'm hearing you correctly, that kind of inheritance might be more important than for economic growth than democracy per se.
Possibly, and the inheritance of the concept of the Chinese state had an almost democratic-like element in it, in that there was an ideology that said that the state has to serve the population, otherwise it loses its mandate. It was called the mandate of heaven. Okay, there was a tradition that the emperor had to be benevolent towards the people. Just as the father, who was all-powerful in the family, had to be benevolent toward the family. So within a framework of very paternalistic institutions, there were notions of obligations and moral responsibilities. Now, that's quite alien to the way that we think today in the West. You know, we don't like this kind of paternalism and hierarchy and authority. But having evolved that notion of moral responsibility, perhaps that was relatively advanced compared to some of the forms of tyranny that existed before it and were contemporaneous with it, a few hundred years ago. So it has some elements that actually are pro-developmental in the modern context. I mean, I truly believe that East Asian governments were manned by people with a nationalistic mission to raise their countries up, which is an incredibly valuable form of human capital.
Yeah. Nationalism is human capital. Very interesting. What about the role of multinational multilateral institutions? I'm thinking about the United Nations. I'm thinking about the World Bank. I'm wondering how one implements the kinds of policy that you think would be best suited to promoting reduction of global poverty when we have all these distinct nation states with their particular interest and parochialisms and competitions ongoing, and whether some kind of global governance compact that cuts across national lines isn't a essential aspect of the reform and institutional development that we need to reduce poverty in the world.
Yeah, so that's one of those hairs that I would like to to try to split. I mean, I see the virtue in the idea that institutions have to develop from the, from the bottom up within a society, and they can't just be imposed. But on the other hand, I do think that international frameworks of law and international organizations that are ready to assist individual countries to commit themselves to and adhere to certain standards can play a very important role. So I guess I'm a bit hawkish on the side that institutions like the United Nations and the African Union and ECOWAS and so forth, these regional institutions, they might be able to make an important difference. And I definitely would, applaud more resources going into those sorts of regional as well as international organizations, with the, proviso that we understand that they can't simply impose the institutions on a given country. There has to be some allowance for diversity, and there has to be the domestic demand for it. Otherwise, it can't really get started.
Okay, well, I think we've reached a natural stopping point, Louis. I really want to thank you. Your book, The Good, the Bad, and the Economy, is an important work, and I'm really proud that this kind of research is going on here at Brown. I can get a little bit of reputational benefit out of the progress that you're making on your problems.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed the conversation, and you do have an open invitation to help me research these questions when you find time, Glenn. So,
well, we should sit down over lunch or something, Louis, soon.
Thanks for the conversation.
Bye-bye.
Bye.